tenants get free representation in most court houses across California, at least Southern California, that I'm aware of. And do you want to end up in a jury trial? Or they'll bluff the landlord all the way to a jury trial to extend the occupancy of the tenant. You're out that much more rent, time, frustration, headaches. Why would a buyout agreement be a better option as opposed to, the eviction process?
Because it's going to save you money and time.
Hi, this is Chris German, and welcome back to the Apartment Dealer Show. Do we have a show for you today? Today, we're going to discuss tenant buyout agreements, otherwise known as cash for keys agreements. And with me today, I have none other than Mr. Dennis Munoz. Now, Dennis has specialized in tenant buyout agreements for about the last 10 years. And prior to that, had 8 years experience in property management. So he knows exactly the ins and outs of dealing with your tenants. And given his experience, specifically in starting at LA City, now his business has gone abroad. But he worked the toughest city, cut his teeth on the toughest city in terms of dealing with tenants because the regulations there are so tough when you look to buy out tenants. He has that experience, so it makes all the other cities that much easier. But Dennis, thank you for being
Thank you very much for having me here.
Yeah, so this tenant buyout agreements 5 years ago would not have been on the minds of people, say, who owned outside of LA City, because there was no need. There was no rent control law. None of that existed. They simply could give a tenant a notice to vacate, and they'd have to vacate. Of course, though, in LA City, this has been around for some time because the city basically says you have to pay people. They give you the specific amounts, whether it's a family, how many individuals in a unit, how old are they. LA City has been very specific, but now that we have statewide rent control, and now that some of the surrounding cities to LA have come up with their own rent control, now landlords are beginning to say, okay, I need to learn more about that. I need to see what this is about because this is going to be their only hope of getting units back. So you are a very good tool for them. They need you. They need you.
Correct. Correct.
But let's start real basic for those that may be unfamiliar with what a tenant buyout agreement is. What is cash for keys? They've maybe heard the term, but aren't necessarily, they don't know what's involved. So what is a cash for keys program, and what circumstances do landlords use it for?
Landlords usually do cash for keys under various circumstances. For example, when they want to remodel the unit to get market rent, when you have squatters in the unit, when they want to do owner-occupied, and also to avoid an eviction process. Because if you go through an eviction process, you're going to spend more money, more time, instead of making a voluntary agreement to vacate the premises.
Mm-hmm. So while it may seem like a large sum of money up front, depending on your situation, you actually might be saving yourself money by doing these voluntary agreements as opposed to going to court and dealing with a jury trial.
Correct. And also it's a time saving because if you go to an eviction process, you don't know how much money you're going to spend in legal fees, court fees, filing fees, plus a lack of rental. Mm-hmm. You cannot collect the rent. It's much better just to approach to the tenants and try to make a voluntary agreement. That way you will know when the tenants move out, how much money are you going to pay them, and when you will take possession of the unit.
And obviously what you're putting together, your role is you're not doing a handshake agreement with the tenants. You actually have a document they're signing, and you're the one that's coordinating the exchange for money so that the landlord is protected in that way, so that, again, it's clear, right?
Correct.
It's clear what's expected of both sides.
That's very important what you're saying because everything has to be in compliance with the law. That's my job. I have to make sure the agreement is in compliance with the law because the tenants, they have rights. So it's very important for us to let the tenant know what the rights are and give them the information. It's a disclosure notice. Every city, they have their own ordinance and rules. So it's very important that we check in the website or with the city laws before we approach to tenants, just to give the tenants the right information.
More and more cities are beginning to adopt their own ordinance. I mean, I even talked to eviction attorneys who aren't necessarily, they can't stay on top of it. Maybe because a city passes an ordinance and it's not like they put an ad in the newspaper. Unless you call the city or go to the website like you mentioned.
Correct.
Many people don't know. Just this past Monday, the city of Bell Gardens held a meeting to discuss their ordinance, which is already in existence, but they're thinking about changing it. And the apartment association, which their role is to help landlords, and so forth. Their alert to tell people that this meeting was going to happen didn't go out till Monday morning. So even the apartment association did not know there was going to be this meeting. I got the email around 9 a.m. I immediately forwarded it to everyone who owns multifamily properties in Bell Gardens. But even myself, the show, and I just learned about another city this week who had some special rules, and I'm like, wow, it's just a lot for the
right. Every city is changing their rules and ordinance very often. Mm-hmm. So you have to, before you come up and talk to the tenants, it's very important that you know what the rules and regulations for that city are.
And I imagine if you do it wrong, you would be helping out the tenant and their attorney if you do it completely wrong,
right.
Giving them a good case too.
Exactly. You want to avoid any legal issues. So it's very important that everything that you're doing is in compliance with the law, not just the city, also with the federal law as well.
So we've spent a good amount of time talking about the legal aspect of this, but are there any other legal considerations that should be on the mind of landlords they need to be aware of before they approach a tenant with a buyout agreement?
Based on my experience, I can tell you it's very important to give them the right documentation. You want to be honest with the tenant because sooner or later they're going to find out what their rights are. It's not that difficult. They can go online, they can ask a neighbor, they can go and ask an attorney and get some legal advice. And it will be a nightmare for you if you're not completely honest with the tenants at the front. So it's better to be prepared, do the right approach, and give them the right information.
I had just heard so I'm selling a property for a client. And I didn't know that my client actually had approached the tenants in the past with buyout agreements. I didn't know this. And when he didn't get a favorable response, he started doing things like cutting the water to the building and cutting utilities and all this stuff. And stuff you'd see in a movie or maybe they did 20 years ago. But it's like, okay, well, now you've given the tenants a really good case and probably created a situation where they're not going to agree to any agreement because now they're being treated unfairly.
Right. They take, from the perspective side of the tenants, they take this as a threat and personal. So now it will be close to impossible for the tenants to move out. First of all, because they already have legal advice for sure. And then they think that they're their home and they feel attacked. So they're not going to move. I have a case where a landlord, he wants to try to do the buyouts himself, and he approached two tenants. They didn't come up with an agreement. So he started doing things like that where he was cutting the hot water. It got to the point that the tenants got together and got the news involved in the building. You don't want that. For sure, you don't want that.
Yeah, KTLA live. You don't want them on your property, right?
Right. You don't want them.
And I imagine sometimes by the time the landlord comes to you, they've tried on their own and fumbled the ball. So by the time they give it to you, they've messed everything up where it's made your job that much more complicated.
Correct. So what I recommend to landlords is get a third party involved. It's always the best thing to get a third party involved. First of all, because you want to keep the relationship between the landlord and tenant in a great condition. And if you approach and you're not giving them not just the right information, probably you're lying or you don't know all the information, they're going to take as you're lying to them. So you want to build trust with the tenant. So my recommendation is always involve a third party company, and that's what we do.
Of course, you said one of the options to use the buyout agreement is that, let's say you have an issue with a tenant, could lead to an eviction, and maybe the landlord has a very good case. Cut and dry, that the tenant is wrong, landlord is right. But even still, as a landlord, you have to ask yourself, do you want to spend the time in court, trying to go through the eviction? Nowadays, they're going to take you to jury trial because the tenants get free representation in most court houses across California, at least Southern California, that I'm aware of. And do you want to end up in a jury trial? Or they'll bluff you, they'll bluff the landlord all the way to a jury trial to extend the occupancy of the tenant. You're out that much more rent, time, frustration, headaches. Why would a buyout agreement be a better option as opposed to, the eviction process?
Because it's going to save you money and time. So once you approach to the tenant, you can make a good offer and save, instead of paying, $25,000 for a jury trial, you can make a negotiation when will be a win-win situation for both parties. Why? Because the tenant will live with clean record. We can give them references if he wants to look for another apartment. And the landlord will take possession of the unit, and he knows how much money he's going to pay to the tenant and when he's going to take possession of the unit. Also, it's important, people, when they receive a notice of an eviction, they take it personal. They can damage the property. You don't want that. If you can avoid all those items and just to try to make an agreement, it will be a win-win situation.
What are some of the common challenges that you find? So now I'm the landlord. I've hired you on my behalf to go, begin this negotiation process. What are some of the common challenges?
Some of the common challenges are for the tenants, they've been living there for so many years. That's why the rent is so low. For them is a home. There's their house. So you have to take the time to listen what they have to say. Every case is different. Every situation is different. So you have to, once you approach them and you listen what are their needs, we can come up with a solution.
I've heard some stories where the grandparents were in the unit and then they raised their kids in the unit, and now they're raising you're multi-generational, especially in LA City, you hear this stuff. So they're paying $600 for a 2-bedroom or just some crazy amount. So how can the challenges that you face, how can they be avoided? If I'm the landlord, and I imagine many instances, the landlords are like, okay, Dennis, I want to get out of this as cheaply as I can. Go offer them $500. And that creates its own challenge. But,
correct. Yeah. But in order to get the units back, we have to be realistic. It has to be a fair compensation. So you have to see how much money are you losing every month. How much money are you losing a year, and what will be the market value of the property once this tenant move out and you remodel the unit. That's very important. Mm-hmm. So you have to put numbers that are realistic because, again, these people, they've been living in these units for 20, 25 years. Some people, they think that they're going to die in these units. They don't look in for another places because they've been living there for so many years. So again, every situation is different. Until you approach to them and know what their needs are, we can take a solution.
And obviously, I'm on the side of the landlords. The landlords, you're my clients, and I'm a landlord. My wife and I own buildings ourselves. But just, what's the saying there? But before the grace of God go I. In other words, we don't know how they were raised, what's being put into their head from the news, their friends, the politicians that are feeding them the lies that essentially it's them versus landlords. It's the haves versus the have-nots. And so that creates its own challenge, the culture, I guess is what I'm saying. The culture, especially today, where people are basically being told, you can't own a home, you never will own a home. Those that do own the homes are evil, and somehow they own real estate because they did something dirty-handed to get there. That is the mindset of people, or could be the potential mindset, and that's what you're up against, is that they have this bad concept of a landlord, and really the culture is feeding them that, no, as you're the tenant, you have rights, you should stand your ground. So essentially, Dennis, when I talk about the culture, the mindset of the tenants, for a lot of people, it's not just dollars and cents, where we might think, hey, I offered the guy 10 grand. Why doesn't he just go? That's a great payday. There's other things that are going into it emotionally for them and everything else.
Right. So they get attached to the place they will live. Again, for them is home. So you have to do a great approach and listen what they need. I'm gonna give you an example. This is something that I call a home run. So landlord bought a fourplex, and we have in the upstairs unit, we have an older gentleman. He was in his late 80s, and he's been living at the property for over 25 years. So he has the opportunity to move with his kids, but he wants to live by himself. He doesn't want to move anywhere. So I approached to him, and part of my conversation was, what's going to happen if you need to go downstairs for an emergency? How you're in a daily basis go upstairs and downstairs. So because I was a third party, he realized that he needs to find another place. So we were able to come up with an agreement in money and time, and he moved out. And because that unit was vacant, we transferred another tenant that I was living in the unit downstairs. When he moved in, he was single, but he's been living for 20 some years. Now he's married with 2 kids, living in 1-bedroom unit. Upstairs was 2 bedrooms, so we were able to transfer the downstairs tenant to the upstairs unit. So that's what I call a home run, because we were able to vacate all the premises and get market rent.
So speaking of vacating all the premises, and I maybe should have mentioned this earlier, but when I first became familiar with Dennis and his work, the first challenge I gave him was, hey, I just sold my client a 19-unit building in the city of Baldwin Park. And for those of you that aren't familiar, and even if you don't own in Baldwin Park, you should listen up, because these same rules may be coming to you shortly. But Baldwin Park in 2020 came up with their own rent control ordinance. And we're talking pre-COVID. So this was not premised on helping people through COVID. Long story short, they basically said you can raise your rents a maximum of 4% ceiling. The state was offering at least 10%. And you cannot essentially vacate units to do substantial improvements. Now, their law was a little cloudy. It didn't say it specifically, but Mike Brennan, the eviction attorney who you guys have seen on my show, I took the ordinance to him and he said, it doesn't specifically say it, but there's enough language here, probably better to approach cash for keys. And I thought, well, this is interesting. Really, up until then, the only work that I had seen with tenants cash for key buyout agreements was in LA City. Because again, this was something new going to the other cities. So I called around, I was referred to Dennis, and I got a good feel for Dennis. He definitely knew what he was talking about, had the experience in property management. So he said, okay, 19 units, let's see what you can do. And Dennis was able to clear the entire property. Didn't happen overnight, didn't happen for $5. But the bottom line is, going back to Dennis's comments earlier, when in speaking with the owner, or you yourself have to ask yourself this question, the rental amount is X right now. Well, how many hundreds or thousands of dollars could it be potentially if I could raise that unit to market? First question. Second question, well, how much does that mean over the course of 12 months or 24 months? Third question, obviously the value of your property is tied to the income it collects. Now you might need a broker's assistance to figure out this next one. But if you were to take that unit at a very low rent, move it to market, how much more does that increase the value of your property? And you had said that's one of the equations that, in other words, instead of it looking at it as, well, Dennis is telling me I should offer them $15,000. $15,000 is a lot of money. And it is, but maybe not if we consider how quickly you're going to recoup that $15,000 and how much that's going to move the property up in value. So back to the 19 unit. You cleared the entire property.
Correct.
My client was able to move the units all to market rent. So not only is that property now a cash cow for my client, but the value has changed tremendously.
Substantially, yes.
And going through the 19 units, because that might sound like a big project, how do you go about it? Because I imagine you approach tenant number one, they run and they start talking, or different, and maybe some do, some don't, but how does that play out usually?
Right. We use different strategies depending on how many units is the building. But in this case, we approach to 5 tenants at the same time. We choose different tenants, and based on what they're paying on rent, we approach to them. We start negotiating. And of course, after we speak with all these 5 tenants, the whole building, all the tenants, they know what exactly we were doing. Instead of we approach to them, they start calling me. They started calling me and said, "Hey, why do you have an approach to? Why you don't want to talk to me?"
I want something to do.
Right. It's something that I need to do, or so we didn't give them any information at the time. We just said, you know what, the corporation just give us instructions just to approach to these people. Let's see what they said. But that's good because you put that in their mind that they're gonna be next, and they start looking for places. By the time that I approach to the next 5, they already have all this information.
Yeah, no, obviously our client was very happy with the outcome. We're happy for her, so that went very well. The relationship between landlord and tenant, because I'm sure some landlords are watching this saying, okay, sounds good, but what if I send you, Dennis, out there to talk to them, and now it makes the relationship sour? The tenant doesn't like that they've been approached, they're gonna say no, and then going forward, maybe they're going to, not be the nicest towards the landlord. So how does it have an effect on the relationship between the tenants and the landlords?
It has a big impact. My advice to landlords is just to be honest. We have to be honest and have an open and clear communication with the tenant. I think that's part of my business be successful, because if you do the right approach and you give them the information and making sure that everything is in compliance with the law, even if they don't want to move out, at least when they go and ask questions to an attorney or look online or call the housing department, they know the information that you gave them, it was the right information.
So it makes you look like you're
doing the right thing.
You're doing the right thing. Yeah, it's not some shady under.
Correct. You don't need to do that. That's not it. In order to make the negotiation happen, it's better to be honest with the tenant and tell them what's going on. And some people, they will do it. They understand the business too. Again, every case is different.
Yeah, no, I just approached one of my tenants. A buyout agreement wasn't needed because of the location. But like you said, they understood. I worked out an agreement with them, and then they feel like they're being treated fairly. But if you tell them one thing, then they go to the city and the city says, oh no, it's another. Right there, you've shot yourself in the foot.
That's right.
Thinking that the tenants aren't going to find out or what have you. Yeah.
Correct.
Have you had much experience where you give the tenant some money up front and then they don't keep their end of the bargain? They end up staying and trying to keep the money, and they back out. They try to back out of the agreement.
Yes, but the percentage is very, very, very low. Once someone signs an agreement, 99% of the time they move out. Or, for instance, if they're gonna ask you for a little bit more of time, it happens. I apply for this place, the place is not ready, but here's my lease agreement, or here's the number for the new landlord. You can confirm the flooring is not ready yet, and I need an extra week, 2 weeks. Or sometimes they can say, you know what, something happened to my car. It's any way that you can increase for another $1,000. You never know. But 99% of the people, once they sign the agreement, is because they're going to move out.
And so that brings up a good question. What's the overall success rate you have in terms of approaching tenants and those that actually accept the buyout agreement?
In LA City, it's 50%. In county, I'm working right now Riverside County. I'm working in Long Beach, Santana, all over. It's increased the percentage. I will say 70% of the people will take the buyout.
Because they don't have the protections nearly as much as else.
Correct. It's different. The owners, they have options too,
Right. So let's talk about structuring the buyout agreement. So you mentioned right now that, sometimes structure to it could be some money up front, some at the end. What typically goes in, you've approached a tenant and they say, okay, I'm open to a conversation. What are some various ways to structure that buyout agreement?
Okay, once you approach the tenants and listen what they have to say, again, some people will say, I'm ready to get retired. So they don't need a lot of money on front because they have already money, you can tell. Or I want to move to another state and I have some money on savings. With this extra money, I think that I can buy a property in Las Vegas. I can work from home. I'm going to live with my girlfriend. I'm going back to live with my parents. So it depends on the conversation, but for sure, I've seen more cases where we need to give them tenants some money on front. again, depends. We go case by case, but at least you have to give them, I will say, 40 to 50% when they sign in the agreement.
And I'm sure, the agreements, you have the tenant signing, they're ironclad. There's multiple pieces to it. But in general, is the tenant basically saying, okay, I agree to vacate by this day. I agree this is the amount of money that's going to exchange hands. Is it general provisions in it? Is there any provisions in it that says, if I agree, but don't move out?
Right.
There's...
Correct. So let me tell you about the agreement. Basically, it says the tenant's responsibilities and the landlord responsibilities. So how the tenant is going to get compensated, how much, what will be the payments, how are we going to give them the payments. Also, it says the date the tenant has to move out. Sometimes we can put in the agreement, we're going to waive 2 months of rent. That's part of the negotiation. We can say also this is what I call bonus. If the tenant moves sooner, let's say we make an agreement where the tenant has to vacate the premises in 3 months, but if you vacate within 30 days, instead of giving you $10,000, we're going to give you $12,000. That's an incentive for the tenant to move faster, and we will get the premises sooner. Mm-hmm. Part of the agreement also will say, if the tenant doesn't move out, we not just collect the money, we will sue him for the money that we're giving him in front. Also, we will start an unlawful detainer, an eviction. And
outside of LA City, I had a client friend of mine, Brian, shout out to Brian Abernathy Insurance Services. The cities where there isn't a special ordinance, and I was talking about, hey, I want to vacate some units, do a remodel and so forth. He's like, well, here's one thing you could do is come up with an agreement, a financial agreement with them, and then have the tenant give you notice that they're going to vacate, essentially like a 60-day notice. They're giving me, because then if they renege, you go to court, I just show up to court and say, Judge, they gave me a notice that they were going to vacate. Now, obviously, something like that doesn't work in LA City, but I thought, that's pretty genius in the sense that it's the tenant giving me notice.
Right.
There's nothing to argue about if we go to court. So we've had that work out too.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah. Looking ahead, there's a new rent control bill that's going to be on the November ballot. For those of you who maybe don't know, there's 3 pieces to that. Number 1, single family homes, which are not currently under rent control, would then be under rent control. Right now, properties, if they're built within the last 15 years, and that's a rolling calendar, they're not under rent control, statewide rent control. All properties would be under rent control. But the nail in the coffin is, if you have a vacancy, right now, if you get a vacant unit, you could raise that rent to whatever prevailing market rental rate is. In the bill, there's actually vacancy control, a third party telling you how much you would be able to rent a vacancy for, which I'm sure is going to be predicated on how much the previous tenant was paying. That would be a nightmare for the industry. So we'll kind of put that one aside. But obviously, other things are changing. Come April, if you want to move out tenants to improve the property, now you have to pull permits and jump through other hoops. How do you see the landscape as the laws are changing and tenant rights are changing? How do you see these buyout agreements changing over time?
I see the landlords, they're going to be using, and this will be more popular. It will grow and expand the tenants buyout agreements because the laws are changing rapidly. No against landlords, but it will be more difficult for landlords to get the units. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a great alternative, and I see that it's going to grow up very fast.
We didn't get into, how much you charge and compensation, because who knows when they're going to be watching the videos. So I think, that conversation, if this sounds interesting, then you can have that conversation. We get into, but I can tell you, it's very economical. When I met you and you were sharing with me the compensation, I thought, well, wow. I mean, it's really fair. I mean, obviously you got to make a profit, but it wasn't nowhere near, honestly, what I thought you would be charging people for this, because many people, they don't want to deal with this sort of thing. And so, I thought, well, so if this guy's doing one of the ugliest pieces of management, he's getting paid handsomely. But no, I can tell you, from my perspective, it's definitely economical. For many of you, it's going to be financially rewarding if you do that analysis. What's the difference between what the tenant's paying now, what potentially you could charge over the course of a year or two, how quickly you recoup those monies, and then how much it moves the property value. contact us. We'll put you in contact with Dennis should you be in need of his services. Dennis, I want to thank you. I mean, you're doing a great service.
Thank you
to landlords. Like I said,
thank you.
It really is one of the ugliest kind of components of management.
It's not easy.
Yeah, landlords. This is probably the area where landlords feel the most uncomfortable is approaching tenants to vacate and so forth. So, all right, sir. Well,
thank you very much. Thank you, Chris.
So there you have it. Tenant buyout agreements, otherwise known as cash for keys, could be one weapon to have in your arsenal. Bottom line is you're building a financial legacy by owning multifamily properties. Maybe this is one thing that you can add to your strategy that will only increase the size of that legacy and the impact it has for you and your generations to come. I hope that you found today's episode informative. Give the video a like, share a comment below, subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. Hundreds of hours of content on our channel. I can't imagine you haven't subscribed already, but if you haven't, please do so. Share this video with every landlord you know. Tenant buyout agreements, cash for keys agreements are going to become more and more popular as the rules change here in the state. Everybody needs this information. And until next time, this is Chris German, the apartment dealer, wishing you positive cash flow, tenants who behave, and much protection from Uncle Sam. Till next time.